A father returns unexpectedly and discovers that his daughter lives alone and neglected, shattering the illusion of a perfect family. From pain and guilt arises his fight to reclaim love and rebuild the bond that silence destroyed. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Continuing, the private jet landed at Midway International Airport amidst the fine rain falling over Chicago. Edward Thompson looked out the window, contemplating the skyline dotted with skyscrapers that stretched as far as the eye could see. At 45, he was one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the technology sector in the United States, owner of the largest digital security startup in North America. The trip to California to finalize partnerships with Silicon Valley giants had been exhausting but productive. He decided not to announce his early return. He wanted to surprise his 8-year-old daughter, Julia. The girl, with her large expressive eyes and captivating smile, was the light of his life, even after the diagnosis of Down syndrome that had completely altered his expectations when she was born. Louise, his first wife, couldn't bear the pressure and abandoned him when the girl was just 2 years old. Vanessa, his current wife, entered their lives 3 years later, bringing back the sense of family that Edward so cherished. "Where to, sir?" the driver asked, interrupting his thoughts. "Home, Anthony. Straight home." The black Mercedes cut through the busy avenues of the Gold Coast, one of Chicago's most exclusive neighborhoods. Edward felt a growing unease. His trips had become more frequent in recent months, and the guilt of leaving Julia consumed him more and more. Vanessa always reassured him, promising she would care for the girl as if she were her own daughter. As they approached the mansion in Lincoln Park, Edward noticed the gate ajar, something unusual for a residence of that standard. He asked the driver to stop a little earlier and decided to enter on foot, unannounced. The impeccable garden, with its tall trees and perfectly manicured lawn, contrasted with the strange silence that hung over the property. Normally at that hour, Julia would be playing under the supervision of Mrs. Frances Dawson, the governess who had worked for the family for almost a decade. Upon entering through the side door that led to the kitchen, Edward was greeted by a strong smell of alcohol and leftover food. The sight he found froze his heart. Julia was sitting on the cold floor, wearing a crumpled dress with food stains. Her brown hair, normally neatly combed, was disheveled. Around her, scattered on the floor, were remnants of canapes and snacks. "Julia?" he called, his voice choked with confusion and anguish. The girl looked up, her eyes widening in recognition and surprise. For a brief instant, fear crossed her gaze before a hesitant smile lit up her face. "Daddy!" "You're back!" she exclaimed, but didn't get up. Instead, she hurried to gather more food, frantically stuffing it into her mouth. "What are you doing, sweetie?" Edward asked, kneeling beside her. "I need to eat everything before the food runs away," Julia replied mechanically, as if repeating something she had been taught to say. "If I don't eat now, there won't be any left later." Edward felt a knot form in his throat. He looked around and realized the leftovers seemed to be from a party. The kitchen table was covered with dirty dishes, empty champagne bottles and overflowing ashtrays. "Where is Mrs. Dawson?" "And Vanessa?" he asked, keeping his voice calm so as not to scare his daughter further. "Mrs. Dawson is in her room. Aunt Vava said she couldn't leave today," Julia replied, using the affectionate nickname she gave her stepmother. "Aunt Vava is in the living room with her friends." Edward helped his daughter up, noticing how she flinched at his touch as if expecting a reprimand. This reaction set off an alarm in his mind. Julia had always been affectionate and receptive to his love. "Let's clean you up a bit." "Princess," he said, grabbing a napkin from the table and gently wiping his daughter's face. That's when he heard a slurred voice coming from the living room. "That useless creature must be rummaging in the trash again." Edward froze. The voice belonged to Vanessa. He held Julia's hand and walked silently to the door, separating the kitchen from the living room. The scene he witnessed made his blood boil. Vanessa was sprawled on the Italian leather sofa, wearing a party dress, a drink in her hand. Beside her, a man Edward recognized as Raphael, Vanessa's brother, was laughing uncontrollably. "You shouldn't let that waste of a life wander around." "Sis," Raphael said, refilling his sister's glass, "what if someone important shows up and sees that aberration?" "Edward pays a lot to keep up appearances," Vanessa replied, giving a bitter laugh. But it's getting harder and harder to pretend I have any affection for that retard. The word hit Edward like a punch to the gut. He took a deep breath, controlling the rage that threatened to overwhelm him. Julia, beside him, seemed to shrink further and further, as if the cruel words were whips lashing her delicate skin. "Julia," Edward whispered, crouching down to his daughter's eye level, "I want you to go to your room, okay? Daddy will talk to Aunt Veva and then come be with you." The girl nodded, her eyes revealing an understanding that went far beyond her age. She turned and went upstairs almost silently, like someone accustomed to becoming invisible. Edward entered the living room. The silence that followed was like the prelude to a storm. "Edward!" Vanessa exclaimed, almost spilling her drink as she tried to stand up. "Darling, you didn't say you were coming back today." "Clearly," he replied, his voice as sharp as ice. Raphael stood up, visibly uncomfortable. "Brother-in-law, what a surprise. I was just passing through—" "Spare me the explanations, Raphael," Edward cut him off. Turning to Vanessa, he continued, "I want you to compose yourself. We'll talk when you're sober, and I don't want to see your brother in this house again." Vanessa opened her mouth to protest, but Edward's gaze silenced her. He turned and went upstairs, needing all his self-control not to explode right then and there. The woman who had sworn to love and care for his daughter had just revealed a monstrous side he had never imagined existed. Upon entering Julia's room, he found his daughter sitting on the edge of the bed, swinging her legs that didn't reach the floor. She seemed too small and fragile in that space, decorated with teddy bears and pastel colors. A painful contrast to the cruel words he had just heard. "Daddy will stay with you tonight, okay?" he said, sitting beside her. Julia nodded, leaning timidly against his arm. "Are you leaving again tomorrow?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. "No, Princess. Daddy isn't going anywhere," he replied, feeling the weight of those words and the implicit promise in them. The Chicago sky finally brightened after a night of intermittent rain. Edward hadn't been able to sleep a wink. He remained seated in the armchair beside Julia's bed, observing his daughter's restless sleep. Several times during the night she mumbled disconnected words and stirred under the covers, as if fighting invisible nightmares. "I have to eat everything. Otherwise the food runs away," and she repeated in her sleep, words that cut Edward's heart like sharp blades. When the first rays of sun penetrated through the tulle curtains, Edward silently got up. It was then that he noticed something under Julia's bed, the tip of a colorful notebook. Carefully, so as not to wake his daughter, he pulled it out. It was a sketchbook, hidden like a forbidden treasure. The pages were filled with surprisingly expressive drawings for an 8-year-old child. What caught his attention most was a yellow bear that appeared in almost every illustration, sometimes smiling, sometimes crying, but always present. On one page there was a drawing of a house divided in half. On one side, vibrant colors, and the yellow bear smiling. On the other, dark shadows and faceless figures. "Is that our house?" Edward whispered to himself, feeling a knot in his throat. Another drawing showed a small girl, clearly Julia, surrounded by menacing shadows, while a plane flew away in the blue sky. Edward didn't need to be a psychologist to understand the meaning. These were his constant trips, leaving his daughter vulnerable to the shadows that surrounded her. "Daddy." Julia's sleepy voice made him quickly close the notebook and return it to its hiding place. He turned with a forced smile. "Good morning, Princess. Did you sleep well?" Julia nodded timidly, but her eyes said otherwise. Edward sat on the edge of the bed and stroked her disheveled hair. "How about we have breakfast together today? I can make those pancakes you like so much." The girl's eyes lit up for an instant, but soon the shadow of fear returned. "Will Aunt Vava let me?" The innocent question revealed much more than Edward was prepared to hear. He felt the anger grow again, but he controlled himself. "Of course. This is your home, Julia. You can eat whatever you want whenever you want." He helped his daughter get dressed, noticing small bruises on her arms, which looked like finger marks. Each discovery was like a dagger in his chest, increasing the certainty that much more was happening in that house during his absences than he had ever imagined. As they went down to the kitchen, Edward was surprised to find Vanessa already awake, impeccably dressed and made up, preparing coffee as if nothing had happened the night before. The smell of alcohol had given way to the aroma of fresh bread and freshly brewed coffee. "Good morning, darling." "I've made your favorite coffee," she said with a radiant smile, approaching to kiss him. Edward dodged, placing himself protectively in front of Julia. He noticed Vanessa's gaze harden for a second before returning to her practiced smile. "Julia, dear, your breakfast is over there," Vanessa indicated, pointing to a plate at the end of the table. Edward looked and saw a piece of stale bread and a cup of milk that looked diluted. It contrasted drastically with the lavish table prepared for him: eggs, fresh fruit, cheeses, and artisanal breads. "Julia will eat the same as me," Edward declared, pulling a chair beside him for his daughter. Vanessa froze for an instant, but quickly regained her composure. "Of course, darling. I just thought she'd prefer something simpler. You know how she is, selective with food." Edward generously served Julia's plate with fruit and scrambled eggs. He noticed how his daughter hesitated before each mouthful, as if waiting for permission. "Eat, princess. It's all right," he encouraged her. It was at that moment that Mrs. Francis Dawson entered the kitchen. The governess, an older woman with calloused hands and a shrewd gaze, paused for a moment upon seeing Edward. There was something in her eyes, relief perhaps. "Mr. Thompson, it's good that you're back," she said, nervously adjusting her apron. "Good morning, Francis," Edward replied, noticing the quick glance the governess cast at Julia and then at Vanessa. "Francis, you can take the day off today," Vanessa quickly intervened. "I've already prepared everything for breakfast." "That won't be necessary," Edward cut in. "Francis stays. In fact, I'd like to speak with you later, if possible." The governess nodded, casting a worried look at Julia. "Of course, Mr. Thompson, I'll be at your disposal." While Vanessa chatted about social engagements and charity events she had attended during his absence, Edward silently observed the dynamics in the kitchen. Something was wrong, something beyond what he had witnessed the night before. The way Julia flinched when Vanessa approached, the way Mrs. Dawson avoided looking directly at her employer, all indicated an atmosphere of fear. After breakfast, Edward announced that he would take Julia to the park. Vanessa tried to dissuade him, claiming previously scheduled appointments for the girl. "What appointments?" Edward questioned. "Occupational therapy," Vanessa replied promptly. "On Tuesdays, always at 10 o'clock. Edward consulted his watch. It was 8:30 on a Thursday. The blatant lie intensified his suspicions. "I'll call to reschedule," he said dryly. "Julia deserves a day at the park with her father." Before they left, Edward simulated a call to his office, informing them he wouldn't be working that day. In reality, he was giving Vanessa the impression that he would be leaving the house. He took Julia to the park for a few hours, where the girl played timidly, always looking at him as if fearing he would disappear at any moment. On the way back, Edward called his lawyer and longtime friend, Dr. Henry Taylor. "Henry, I urgently need your services. It's a delicate matter." He left Julia with Mrs. Dawson, whom he discreetly instructed not to leave the girl's side under any circumstances. He told Vanessa he needed to go to the office to resolve some pending issues. "I'll be back in a few hours," he informed her, carefully observing her reaction. "Of course, darling. We'll be waiting for you for dinner," Vanessa replied with that same perfect smile that now seemed like a sinister mask. However, Edward did not go to the office. He parked the car a few blocks away and returned on foot, circling the block to access the back of the property. The mansion had an extensive garden that led to a more secluded area, with a view of the pool and leisure area. Hidden among the trees, Edward had a clear view of what was happening. As soon as his car left the property, the mansion came to life. Loud music began to play, and several cars parked at the entrance. Raphael, his brother-in-law, arrived accompanied by a blonde woman Edward recognized as Deborah, Vanessa's close friend. Both entered laughing loudly, carrying champagne bottles. The impromptu party took over the house. Edward watched, astonished. As Vanessa completely transformed, she laughed scandalously, danced provocatively, completely different from the demure and elegant wife she presented at social events. It was then that he saw Julia timidly appear on the stairs leading to the garden. The girl looked confused at the scene, holding her yellow teddy bear against her chest. Deborah was the first to notice her. "Look who showed up! Vanessa's broken doll," she exclaimed, laughing and pointing at the child. Raphael turned and let out a roar of laughter. "Hey, little monster, the circus is in town." Want to do a special number for us? Edward felt his blood boil in his veins. He was about to intervene when he saw Mrs. Dawson appear in a hurry, pulling Julia away. Raphael blocked the governess's path. "Where do you think you're going, you meddling old woman?" he said, snatching the glass of water the governess was carrying for Julia. "The party has barely begun." Dr. Henry Taylor's office, on the 20th floor of a commercial building on Michigan Avenue, exuded the characteristic sobriety of prominent lawyers. The middle-aged man, with his carefully combed grey hair and impeccable suit, listened attentively to Edward's account, making occasional notes on his pad. "So you believe your wife and her brother are mistreating your daughter?" Henry summarized, after Edward concluded his account of the events of the last 24 hours. "I don't just believe it." "Henry, I saw it with my own eyes," Edward replied, nervously running his hands through his hair. "What I don't know is how long this has been going on. Julia has Down syndrome, but she has always been a cheerful, communicative child. The last few times I came back from trips, I noticed changes in her behavior, but Vanessa always had convincing explanations. She said they were phases, adjustments at school. And now you realize they were lies," the lawyer completed. "Exactly. And the worst part is I don't know how far this situation goes. The bruises on her arms, the constant fear, the phrases she repeats about food that runs away. Henry, she was eating scraps off the floor. Like an animal!" Edward's voice faltered, betrayed by emotion. He took a deep breath, trying to compose himself. "I want a divorce, obviously, and I will fight with all my strength to ensure Vanessa never gets near Julia again. But I need concrete proof, something that leaves no doubt about her conduct." Henry reflected for a few moments, tapping his fingers on the solid wood desk. "Edward, what you are describing constitutes child abuse, possibly sustained psychological abuse. It's a serious crime. But, as you yourself said, we need unquestionable evidence." "What do you suggest?" Edward asked, willing to do anything to protect his daughter. "Surveillance cameras," Henry replied promptly. "Discreet ones installed in the main rooms of the house. If what you suspect is truly happening, we will have irrefutable evidence." "Wouldn't that be illegal? Recording people without consent in my own home?" "In normal circumstances, yes, but we have a vulnerable child potentially in danger. Her well-being overrides privacy issues in this case. Besides, it's your house, your equipment. I know a judge who would perfectly understand the situation." Edward nodded, determined. "How long would it take to install these devices?" "I have contacts with a discreet security company. We can have everything ready in 24 hours, if you can get Vanessa and the others out of the house for a few hours." "Leave that to me," Edward said, already formulating a plan. On the way back home, Edward made another important call to Dr. Camilla Rogers, a renowned child psychologist specializing in children with Down syndrome. The professional, known for her humanized work, agreed to see Julia on an emergency basis the following week. When he arrived home, the impromptu party had ended. The mansion was silent, and Vanessa, as if by magic, had once again assumed the role of the perfect wife. She wore an elegant, casual dress and was sitting on the veranda, leafing through a decorating magazine. "Edward, darling, how was the office?" she asked naturally. "Productive," he replied dryly. "Where is Julia?" "In her room with Francis. The poor dear was a little unwell, you know. I think she ate too much fruit for breakfast." Edward felt the anger grow again, but he kept his composure. He needed to be strategic now. "Speaking of Francis, she mentioned we needed to restock the pantry. I thought we could go to the mall tomorrow, do some shopping. You, me, and Julia, like a family." Vanessa's eyes flashed with suspicion for a second, but soon her practiced smile returned. "Of course, darling. What a great idea. We can have lunch at that Italian restaurant you like." Edward nodded, knowing he had just gained the necessary hours for the camera installation. He went upstairs to see Julia and found her lying down with Francis beside her, telling a story. The governess had an expression of relief upon seeing him. "How is she?" he asked softly. "She's fine now, sir," Francis replied in a whisper. "But earlier—" Edward gestured for her not to continue in front of Julia. "We'll talk later," he murmured. After Julia fell asleep, Edward called Francis to his study. The woman, visibly nervous, sat on the edge of the chair, as if ready to flee at any moment. "Francis, I need you to be completely honest with me. What has been happening in this house when I'm traveling?" The governess wrung her hands in her apron, torn between loyalty to the family and the well-being of the child she had helped raise. "Sir, I'm afraid of losing my job. I have a granddaughter to support." "No one will lose their job for telling the truth, Francis. On the contrary, you have my word." With tears in her eyes, the governess recounted what she had witnessed in recent months, the frequent parties, the derogatory comments, food denied to Julia, orders to keep her locked in her room when there were visitors. "The girl only eats properly when you are home, sir. On other days, Mrs. Vanessa says she needs to learn discipline, that she can't be spoiled. Last week, I found the little one eating the leftovers I purposely left in the kitchen trash. My heart broke, Mr. Thompson. I tried to feed her secretly, but then Mrs. Vanessa started controlling everything that came out of the pantry." Edward felt every word like a stake in his heart. The guilt for not having noticed sooner suffocated him. "Why didn't you tell me, Francis? Why didn't you call?" "I tried, sir, twice. The first time, Mrs. Vanessa intercepted the call. The second time, she confiscated my cell phone for a week, saying it was for me to focus on work. After that, she threatened to report me for theft if I tried again." Edward covered his face with his hands, devastated. His absence had allowed his own home to turn into a nightmare for his daughter. "This ends now, Francis. Tomorrow we're going to the mall. I want you to stay with Julia. Don't leave her alone for a minute." "You can trust me, sir." The next day, as agreed, Edward took Vanessa and Julia to the mall. While they were out, the team hired by Henry discreetly installed cameras at strategic points in the mansion: living room, kitchen, hallways, and pool area. The equipment was almost invisible, camouflaged in decorative objects. Lunch at the mall was an acting lesson. Vanessa perfectly played the role of the loving stepmother, helping Julia cut her food, caressing her hair, making comments about how beautiful she looked that day. Julia, confused by the sudden change in behavior, constantly looked at her father, as if asking for an explanation. Edward merely smiled, encouraging her to enjoy the moment. 3 days passed. Edward remained in constant vigilance, reorganizing his schedule to work from home. The cameras recorded everything. Vanessa, sensing her husband's constant presence, maintained her impeccable facade. But Edward knew it was only a matter of time until the veneer cracked. The opportunity arose when he announced an unavoidable meeting with Japanese investors. "I'll be quick, I promise. 2 hours at most," he assured Vanessa. As soon as his car left the property, Edward parked on a side street and accessed the real-time camera footage on his phone. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. No sooner had the door closed behind him than Vanessa completely changed. She stomped upstairs and entered Julia's room, where the girl was quietly playing with her building blocks. "To the kitchen now," Vanessa ordered, pulling the girl by the arm forcefully. Julia, startled, dropped her yellow teddy bear, which lay abandoned in the middle of the hallway. In the kitchen, Vanessa opened the refrigerator and took out a plate with leftovers from the previous night's dinner. "Today you eat here," she said, throwing the plate on the floor. "Like the dog you are." Edward felt his stomach churn. With trembling hands, he continued watching as his daughter, crying silently, knelt on the cold floor. It was then that the doorbell rang. In the footage, Edward saw Raphael and Deborah enter the house, laughing loudly. "Has the fun begun?" Raphael asked, pointing at Julia. "I'm teaching the little monster discipline," Vanessa replied, serving drinks to her guests. "She thinks she can eat at the table like a person, after Edward spoiled her these past few days." Deborah took out her phone and began filming the scene. "This is going on my private Instagram. My followers will love it." Edward couldn't watch anymore. With his heart pounding and hands trembling, he immediately called Henry. "We have enough evidence," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I need to get my daughter out of that house now." "Stay calm, Edward," the lawyer replied firmly. "If you storm in now like a hurricane, you could complicate the legal process. Let's do this right to ensure they pay for everything." Edward took a deep breath, trying to control the rage that threatened to blind him. "What do you suggest?" "To go back home as if nothing happened. Continue monitoring and recording. Early tomorrow morning, meet me at the office with all the evidence. We'll prepare a formal complaint and request protective orders for Julia." Gathering all his strength to maintain composure, Edward returned to the mansion an hour later. When he entered, he found a completely different scene. Vanessa was sitting on the sofa, elegantly leafing through an architecture magazine. Raphael and Deborah had disappeared, and Julia, now clean and with changed clothes, was sitting quietly in a corner coloring a book. "How was the meeting, darling?" Vanessa asked with her perfect smile. "Productive," he replied dryly, going straight to Julia. He knelt beside his daughter and asked softly, "Is everything okay, princess?" The girl merely nodded, without looking up from her coloring book. Edward noticed that she was drawing with excessive force, almost tearing the paper with the red pencil. During dinner, Edward observed every movement, every interaction. Vanessa served Julia with calculated gestures, smiling sweetly when the girl hesitated to eat. "You need to eat well, dear," she said, in a performance worthy of an award. "Daddy and I want you to grow strong." Edward noticed how Julia looked at her plate and then at Vanessa, as if expecting a trap. The girl was visibly confused by the sudden change in treatment. After dinner, Edward insisted on bathing his daughter and putting her to bed. As he helped her get dressed in her pajamas, he noticed new bruises on her back, marks that certainly hadn't been there days before. "Who did this to you, Julia?" he asked softly. The girl looked away, suddenly interested in her yellow teddy bear. "We can always trust each other." "You know that, don't you?" Edward continued. Julia looked up, her eyes full of an understanding that went far beyond her age. "Aunt Vava said if I tell you'll send me away," she whispered. "Because I'm too much trouble. Because nobody wants a girl like me." The words hit Edward like a punch. He hugged his daughter tightly, controlling the tears that threatened to fall. "That's a lie, princess. The biggest lie in the world. You are what I love most in life. Never ever will I send you away. I promise." That night, Edward barely slept. He spent hours reviewing the camera recordings, meticulously documenting every incident. When day broke, he already had a complete dossier to hand over to Henry. Before leaving, he prepared a special breakfast for Julia: bear-shaped pancakes, star-shaped fruit, and hot chocolate. Vanessa watched the scene with an increasingly tense smile. "You're spoiling that girl too much, Edward," she commented, trying to sound playful. "She'll never learn to fend for herself that way." "She's 8 years old, Vanessa, and she has Down syndrome. She doesn't need to fend for herself," he replied, keeping his voice calm. "Besides, spoiling her with love and affection will only help her develop better." A flicker of irritation crossed Vanessa's eyes, but she quickly regained control. "Of course, darling. You know best." Edward kissed Julia's forehead and whispered in her ear, "Daddy will be back soon. Stay with Mrs. Dawson, okay?" At Henry's office, the legal strategy was outlined. The evidence was compelling. Hours of recordings showing systematic abuse, the governess's testimony, documented bruises, Julia's revealing drawings. "With this, we will achieve not only the divorce, but also immediate protective orders against Vanessa and her brother," Henry stated after analyzing all the material. "Unfortunately, we will have to involve the police. What we are seeing here constitutes a crime." Edward nodded, determined. "Do whatever is necessary. I just want my daughter safe." "We need to act quickly and by surprise," Henry continued. "If Vanessa suspects anything, she might try to destroy evidence or even flee with Julia." The plan was simple. They would return to the mansion with court officers and police to enforce the precautionary measures. Vanessa would be immediately removed from Julia's care, and Raphael would be prohibited from approaching the residence. Meanwhile, at the mansion, Vanessa received a call from Deborah. "Something strange is happening," her friend warned. "Edward was at the mall yesterday with a woman who looked like a lawyer. They talked for a long time, and she was taking notes. An acquaintance of mine saw them." Vanessa felt a shiver of worry. Edward had been acting differently since he returned from his last trip. More attentive, more protective of Julia, less interested in her social engagements. "He must be planning some birthday surprise for me," she replied, trying to convince herself. "Edward would never suspect me. He's too naive." But just in case she decided to act, she went up to Julia's room, where the girl was playing under Francis's watchful eye. "Francis, I need you to go to the market to buy ingredients for dinner. I want to surprise Edward tonight." The governess hesitated. "But Mr. Thompson asked me not to leave the girl alone." "I'm here, aren't I?" Vanessa cut in with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm perfectly capable of looking after her for half an hour." Reluctantly, Francis eventually gave in. As soon as the governess left, Vanessa locked the bedroom door and stared coldly at Julia. "Now it's just the two of us, you aberration. What have you been telling your father?" Julia cowered against the headboard of the bed, hugging her yellow teddy bear as if it were a shield. "Nothing, Aunt Vava, I swear." "Liar!" Vanessa hissed, advancing. "He's acting differently. Someone must have said something." It was then that she noticed the partially hidden sketchbook under the pillow. Before Julia could stop her, Vanessa snatched it and began to flip through it. "So that's it," she murmured, seeing the drawings of the divided house, the shadowy figures, the plane flying away. "You've been showing him this, haven't you?" Julia shook her head, frightened. "It's just for me." "You're going to destroy everything I've built," Vanessa exploded, tearing out some pages from the notebook. "Years dedicated to this marriage, to this life of luxury, and you can ruin everything with your stupid drawings." In a fit of rage, Vanessa began to gather Julia's toys and clothes, throwing everything into a suitcase. "Enough! I'm sending you to a boarding school. I'll tell Edward it's for your own good, that you'll get specialized care there. He'll understand." Julia began to cry desperately, trying to save her yellow teddy bear, which Vanessa threatened to throw in the trash. "Please, Aunt Vava, don't throw him away. This disgusting bear is going in the trash, along with all those silly things you draw." At that moment, they heard the sound of the automatic gate. Through the intercom, Frances announced that she had forgotten the shopping list and needed to return. Quickly, Vanessa composed herself, hid the partially packed suitcase in the closet, and wiped away her own tears. "Not a word about this, understood?" she threatened, pointing her finger at Julia, "or your teddy bear will turn to ashes." The girl nodded, still sobbing. Vanessa left the room, leaving the door open so as not to arouse suspicion, and went downstairs to greet Frances with a practiced smile. Little did she know that every word, every gesture that morning had been captured by the hidden cameras Edward had installed. Edward's black Mercedes, parked in front of the Lincoln Park mansion, followed by 2 discreet police cars, and a car carrying Dr. Henry Taylor, and a social worker assigned by the judge. The operation had been planned with surgical precision, the documents were in order, the protective orders duly issued, and the officers instructed on the sensitivity of the case. "Remember, Edward," Henry said before they exited the vehicles, "stay calm no matter what happens in there. Julia needs you to be level-headed." Edward nodded, adjusting his tie knot like someone preparing for battle. At that moment, he was no longer the successful businessman, the respected millionaire of Chicago. He was just a father determined to protect his daughter at all costs. They rang the doorbell. Inside the mansion, Vanessa adjusted her dress and quickly ran her hands through her hair, imagining it might be Raphael or Deborah arriving unannounced. When she opened the door and saw Edward accompanied by police officers, the smile froze on her face. "What is the meaning of this?" she asked, her voice wavering between indignation and fear. An officer stepped forward, handing her a sealed envelope. "Mrs. Vanessa Mendonça Thompson, I am here to serve a protective order on behalf of the minor Julia Thompson. You are prohibited from having contact with her from this moment on." Vanessa's eyes widened in shock. She turned to Edward, who maintained an impassive expression. "Edward, is this some kind of joke? What are they talking about?" "It's no joke, Vanessa. It's over. I know exactly what you've been doing to my daughter." Vanessa's face went from shock to fury in seconds. "You can't do this. This is my house too, and that retard isn't going to kick me out of it." Her words fell into the tense silence. One of the police officers raised an eyebrow, surprised by the outburst that so quickly confirmed the accusations. "Where is Julia?" Edward asked, ignoring the insult. "In her room with that useless governess," Vanessa replied, crossing her arms in defiance. "But you won't take her. I have rights as a stepmother. I'll sue you for every last penny, Edward Thompson." "I don't think you understand the gravity of the situation," Henry intervened, stepping forward. "We have concrete evidence of sustained abuse against a vulnerable child. Are you aware that this constitutes a crime?" Before Vanessa could respond, Frances appeared at the top of the stairs holding Julia's hand. The girl, seeing her father, let go of the governess and ran down, almost tripping over her own feet. Edward received her with a tight hug, lifting her into his arms. "It's all right now, Princess. Daddy's here. Vanessa watched the scene, her face contorted in a mixture of anger and disbelief. "You'll regret this, Edward," she hissed. "Nobody humiliates me like this and gets away with it." It was then that Henry's phone rang. The lawyer answered, exchanged a few words, and hung up with a discreet smile. "Rafael Mendonça has just been apprehended," he announced. Apparently, he was trying to board a plane at O'Hare International Airport with a one-way ticket to the Bahamas. The news seemed to completely destabilize Vanessa. "What have you done?" "The police served another warrant," one of the officers explained. "Your brother is also prohibited from approaching the minor." Edward handed Julia to the social worker, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, who immediately established a connection with the girl by showing her a small teddy bear she carried in her bag. "Shall we go upstairs to get your things, dear?" the assistant asked. "Your father will accompany us." As they went upstairs, Vanessa remained in the living room, seemingly in shock. But when Edward disappeared down the hallway, she quickly pulled her cell phone from her pocket. "Not so fast, madam," one of the police officers said, holding out his hand. "We need to seize your cell phone as part of the investigation." "This is absurd." "You have no right." "We have a court order," the officer replied, showing the document. "Please cooperate." In Julia's room, Edward found the partially packed suitcase Vanessa had prepared earlier. Inside were crumpled clothes and some carelessly thrown toys. On the floor, pieces of the torn sketchbook. "What happened here?" he asked his daughter, trying to keep his voice calm. Julia hesitated, looking nervously around. "You can talk, dear," the social worker encouraged. "No one will be angry with you." "Aunt Vava got mad about my drawings," the girl murmured. "She said she was going to send me away to a boarding school," Edward completed, feeling a shiver run down his spine. Julia nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "She tore my notebook and was going to throw my teddy bear in the trash." Edward exchanged glances with the social worker, who was taking discreet notes. "Where is your teddy bear now, Julia?" the woman asked. The girl pointed to the closet. Edward opened it and found the yellow bear hidden under several clothes, as if Vanessa had given up on throwing it away at the last minute. "Here he is," he said, handing the toy to his daughter, who hugged it tightly. "No one will ever take him from you again." While they organized Julia's things for their departure, now properly, with the girl choosing what she wanted to take, Edward found something he didn't expect. A small bottle of pediatric sedatives hidden among the blankets. The date on the prescription indicated they had been prescribed more than a year ago for a different child. "Do you take medicine to sleep, Princess?" Edward asked, showing the bottle. Julia frowned, confused. "Aunt Vava puts it in my water when there's a party. She says it's vitamins to make me grow strong, but it makes me very sleepy." Edward felt his blood boil. He handed the bottle to the social worker, who placed it in an envelope marked as evidence. When they returned downstairs, they found Vanessa sitting on the sofa with an officer beside her. She seemed to have regained some of her composure, and now displayed an expression of an unjustly accused victim. "Edward, this is a terrible misunderstanding," she said. Her voice softened. "You know how difficult Julia can be sometimes. I was just trying to set some boundaries for her own good." "Spare us the drama, Vanessa," Edward cut in. "I have hours of videos showing exactly how you set boundaries." Her expression changed instantly. "Videos? What are you talking about?" "Cameras, Vanessa!" "All over the house. Capturing every moment you humiliated my daughter, every time you forced her to eat on the floor, every insult you hurled at her." Vanessa's face visibly paled. "That's an invasion of privacy. It's illegal." "Not when it comes to protecting a vulnerable child," Henry intervened. "The judge has already validated all the evidence." At that moment, the doorbell rang. One of the officers answered and returned accompanied by Deborah, Vanessa's friend. The blonde woman stopped at the entrance to the living room, confused by the scene. "What's going on here?" she asked, looking from Vanessa to Edward. "Deborah, thank goodness you're here," Vanessa exclaimed, standing up. "They're accusing me of mistreating that girl. You need to tell them this is absurd." Deborah hesitated, visibly uncomfortable. She looked at the police officers, at Julia in Edward's arms, and then back at Vanessa. I don't know what you're talking about, Vanessa." "What do you mean you don't know? You were here yesterday. You filmed it yourself with your phone." A heavy silence fell over the room. Deborah took a step back, realizing the trap she had just fallen into. "Madame," one of the officers said, addressing Deborah, "we need you to accompany us to the police station to provide clarification. If you have videos related to the minor, they will also be considered evidence." "I have nothing to do with this," Deborah protested in a panic. "I just came for coffee with my friend." "Your friend just confessed that you participated in and documented the abuse," the officer replied. "Please accompany us without resistance." As Deborah was led away, Vanessa seemed to have lost all color in her face. The reality of the situation finally hit her with full force. "What about my things?" she asked, her voice now small and defeated. "You may take basic personal items. The rest will remain at the residence until a court decision," Henry informed her. "The house belongs to Mr. Thompson. This is unfair. Half of all this should be mine." "Actually," Edward intervened, "our prenuptial agreement is quite clear regarding the separation of assets in the event of criminal conduct by either party. Your lawyer can review Clause 23 if you wish." Vanessa opened her mouth to protest, but the words seemed to have abandoned her. With slumped shoulders, she went upstairs to gather some of her things. Escorted by a female police officer, Edward turned to Julia, who was watching everything with frightened eyes, still clutching her yellow teddy bear. "We're going to our new home, Princess," he said softly. "To a place where you'll be very happy." "Aunt Vava isn't coming?" the girl asked, confused. "No, my love. Aunt Vava did very wrong things and needs to learn that you don't mistreat children." Julia reflected for a moment, her small face contorted in concentration. "The teddy bear can come, right?" Edward smiled, feeling his eyes well up. "Of course. The teddy bear will always be with you wherever you go." Francis approached timidly. "Mr. Thompson, as for me—" "You're coming with us, Francis," he replied promptly. "If you want, of course. Julia needs someone familiar during this transition, and I trust you." The relief on the governess's face was palpable. She bent down to Julia and affectionately adjusted the girl's coat collar. "Come on, little one. Let's go to our new home." The new house was in Lincoln Square, a leafy and quiet neighborhood in Chicago, smaller than the mansion in Lincoln Park, but infinitely more welcoming. Edward had bought the property months earlier, planning to turn it into a real estate investment, but now it would be the home where he and Julia would rebuild their lives. The first day was for adjustment. Julia timidly explored the rooms, always with the yellow teddy bear under her arm, as if fearing someone might still take it from her. Edward watched his daughter with a mixture of pain and hope. How long would it take to erase the invisible scars Vanessa had left? "Do you like your new room, Princess?" he asked as he helped her unpack some toys. Julia looked around at the blank walls and furniture still lacking personality. "Can I paint here?" she asked hesitantly. "Paint? You mean draw pictures?" The girl nodded, her eyes gaining a shy sparkle. "Of course you can," Edward replied, smiling. "In fact, how about we paint together? We can make a mural with all the things you like." Julia's face lit up with a genuine smile, something Edward hadn't seen in a long time. The next morning, the first appointment with Dr. Camilla Rogers, the child psychologist, arrived. Her office, located in a renovated old house in Wicker Park, had colorful walls and a therapy room filled with toys, art supplies and therapeutic games. "Hello, Julia?" the psychologist greeted, a woman in her 40s with curly hair and a welcoming smile. "My name is Camilla and I'm very happy to meet you." Julia partially hid behind her father's legs, observing the environment with cautious curiosity. "Do you like to draw?" Camilla asked, noticing that the girl was not letting go of the sketchbook Edward had bought the night before to replace the one Vanessa had torn. Julia nodded timidly. "Me too. How about we draw together while your father waits outside? Then you can show him what we made." Edward encouraged his daughter with a reassuring smile. "I'll be right outside, Princess. Dr. Camilla is our friend. She'll help you talk about things that might be difficult to tell Daddy." After some hesitation, Julia agreed. Edward waited in the reception area, flipping through magazines without really reading them, his mind full of worries. An hour later, Camilla called him for a quick chat while Julia was entertained with an assistant. "Edward, your daughter is extremely sensitive and intelligent," the psychologist began with professional seriousness. "She expresses through art things she still can't fully verbalize." She showed Edward some of the drawings Julia had made during the session. One of them showed a small girl, clearly Julia, sitting on a kitchen floor surrounded by scattered food. Shadowy figures watched her, laughing. "This one is particularly significant," Camilla explained, showing another drawing. In it, the same girl was lying in a bed, while an adult female figure poured something into a glass. Julia told me that Aunt Vava gave her a special vitamin that made her sleep for a long time. She would wake up confused, sometimes with her clothes changed. Edward felt his stomach churn with the implications. "The sedatives we found," Camilla nodded gravely. "We'll need a toxicology screen to confirm. But it seems your ex-wife was medicating Julia without proper prescription, likely to keep her sedated during parties and social events." "My God," Edward murmured, running his hands over his face in despair. "How did I not notice sooner?" "Don't blame yourself," Camilla said firmly. "Abusers are masters at hiding their acts and manipulating others' perceptions. The important thing is that you found out and acted to protect her." In the days that followed, Edward completely reorganized his professional life. He delegated responsibilities, reduced travel to the indispensable minimum, and set up a home office to be more present in Julia's daily life. Consultations with Dr. Camilla continued 3 times a week. Slowly, Julia began to open up, first through drawings, then with hesitant words, finally revealing what she had experienced in the months Edward was traveling. "I had to wait for everyone to eat," she recounted one night, as Edward helped her brush her teeth. "I could only take what was left. Aunt Vava said it was too much food thrown away, that I had to eat everything so as not to waste it." Edward listened with a heavy heart, struggling to maintain his composure in front of his daughter. "And when there were parties, she would lock me in my room. She said people didn't want to see a girl like me." "A girl like you, how, princess?" Julia looked away, embarrassed. "Broken. That's what Aunt Deborah said. That I was a broken doll." Edward took a deep breath, containing the anger that threatened to consume him again. "You're not broken, Julia. You are perfect exactly the way you are." 2 weeks after the move, something unexpected happened. Edward was in the kitchen trying to prepare dinner, something he had never done before, when he heard a scream coming from upstairs. He rushed up the stairs, his heart pounding, fearing the worst. He found Julia in her room, but there was no problem. She was jumping with joy, pointing to the window. "Daddy, look! A little bird made a nest in our apple tree." Edward approached and saw in the apple tree in the backyard a small nest where a robin was settled. The scene was mundane for most people, but it represented something profound for Julia. The idea that wild creatures chose their new home as a safe place to raise their young. That night, they tried to make pasta. Edward burned the sauce, Julia spilled flour all over the floor, and they ended up laughing uncontrollably as they cleaned up the mess together. They ordered pizza and ate sitting on the living room rug like a small impromptu celebration. "Can we make cake one day?" Julia asked, her mouth stained with tomato sauce. "Of course." "What kind of cake would you like?" "One with the yellow teddy bear drawn on it," she replied promptly, stroking the toy that never left her side. "We'll make it for your birthday," Edward promised. "It'll be the most beautiful cake Chicago has ever seen." Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. The legal process against Vanessa and Raphael continued its course. Both would answer for abuse and psychological mistreatment. Deborah had made a deal with the prosecution, handing over all the videos she had made and becoming a prosecution witness. Edward hired a specialized inclusive education teacher to give Julia private lessons, complementing her schooling. The girl, free from the toxic environment, visibly flourished. Her drawings, once dark and distressing, gained more and more colors and positive elements. The room, once white and impersonal, transformed into a world of colors. Edward kept his promise. Together they painted a mural on the main wall. In the center, a stylized representation of Julia and her father holding hands, with the yellow teddy bear between them. Around them, flowers, animals, stars, and small details that told particular stories of their journey of recovery. 6 months after the move, on a sunny Saturday afternoon, Edward surprised his daughter with a new addition to the backyard. A colorful swing hanging from the apple tree, exactly under the robin's nest, now occupied by 3 chicks. "Do you like it, princess?" Julia's eyes sparkled with excitement. "Can I swing now?" "Of course. It's all yours." Edward helped her sit down and began to push gently. Julia's laughter echoed through the backyard, pure and crystalline as she swung higher and higher. "I'm flying, Daddy! I'm flying!" Mrs. Frances Dawson, who had stayed with them and become a kind of surrogate grandmother to Julia, watched from the veranda with an emotional smile. Beside her, Dr. Camilla, who had come for an informal visit. "Her transformation is impressive," the psychologist commented, observing the scene. "Love works miracles," Frances simply replied. The next day it was Julia's birthday, 9 years old. Edward woke up early and went straight to the kitchen, determined to keep his promise. He spent hours trying to make a yellow bear-shaped cake, following online tutorials. The result was far from perfect, a slightly crooked bear with uneven frosting, but made with all the love in the world. When Julia came downstairs and saw the cake on the kitchen table, her eyes filled with tears of joy. "You made it yourself, Daddy?" "All by myself," he replied, proud of his imperfect creation. "Happy birthday, my princess." The small party gathered only significant people: Frances, Dr. Camilla, Henry, who had become a close friend, and 2 classmates from the special school Julia now attended. Simple, welcoming, full of meaning. As they sang Happy Birthday, Edward watched his daughter's illuminated face and felt a certainty grow in his chest. They had survived the worst and were now rebuilding something beautiful from the shattered pieces. 3 years passed. The house in Lincoln Square now had a flourishing garden, with sunflowers Julia had planted with Frances's help. The walls, once neutral, displayed colorful paintings by the girl herself, who showed an increasingly evident talent for visual arts. On a sunny Sunday, Edward prepared pancakes for breakfast, now with much more culinary skill, while Julia, at 12 years old, set the table. The yellow teddy bear, now a little worn, remained her inseparable companion, sitting in its own chair at the table. "Daddy," Julia called. As she distributed the cutlery, "My art teacher said they're going to open an exhibition at school with the students' best works." "Really? And yours was chosen?" Julia's radiant smile was answer enough. "It's a portrait of us," she explained, her eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. "Me, you, Mrs. Dawson, and the teddy bear, all together on the swing in the apple tree." Edward felt his heart swell with pride. "I can't wait to see it." That afternoon they visited a nearby park. Julia ran ahead, greeting familiar trees like old friends. Edward walked a few steps behind, watching her with a mixture of admiration and gratitude. Suddenly the girl stopped and ran back to him. "Daddy, look, a dandelion." She pointed to a small, delicate white flower, almost invisible in the vastness of the lawn. "Shall we make a wish?" Edward suggested, remembering a childhood tradition. Julia nodded, enthusiastic. Together they blew the fluffy seeds, which danced in the air like tiny parachutes before dispersing with the wind. "What did you wish for, Princess?" Edward asked. Julia smiled, a smile that lit up her entire face and reached her expressive eyes. "I can't tell, or it won't come true, but it was something I already have." That night, after putting Julia to sleep, Edward sat on the veranda with a cup of coffee, reflecting on the journey they had taken. The scars still existed, invisible to most, but increasingly less painful. Therapy continued, now bi-weekly, more for maintenance than for repair. The legal process had ended with Vanessa and Raphael convicted. News of the case had occupied newspaper pages for some time, but now the dust had settled. Edward had refused invitations for interviews and television programs. He didn't want to expose Julia or turn her trauma into a spectacle. What mattered was the present, that house full of light, the colorful drawings on the walls, pancakes on Sunday mornings, the sound of the swing creaking under the weight of a happy child. Edward smiled at the starry Chicago night, a city that had once seemed cold to him and now showed itself full of possibilities. In the room next door, his daughter slept peacefully without nightmares, hugging the yellow teddy bear that symbolized so much in her journey. "My tummy doesn't rumble with hunger anymore," she had said a few days earlier, during a picnic in the garden. Now it plays happy music, and that was the melody Edward heard now, the silent sound of happiness regained note by note, day by day, in the small daily victories that, together, formed the symphony of a life rebuilt with love,